Her model like wax, and she sails like the wind. She is rigged and fitted and curiously trimmed, and all things convenient as for his design. God bless his poor fancy, she is bound for the mind. Few pirate ships could hope to match the fifth-rate flagship of Henry Every, the Fancy. Sailing at the head of a 5-ship armada, she dwarfed the lesser sloops and brigantines so common with pirates. Few opponents dared to resist her, and those who did soon faced a brutal 23-gun broadside. Her decks overflowed with battle-hardened scoundrels, expert at the sword and musket alike. With these tools and with this ship, the crew of the Fancy sailed halfway around the world and back, taking one of the richest prizes in all of history and fading into obscurity. Few pirates ever had the luxury to build their own ship. At best, they might refit an old vessel to their purposes. When Henry Every claimed the Fancy as his flagship, one might have been able to smell the freshness of the wood. She had been built the previous year and named Charles II, not after the King of England, who was dead at this point, but the King of Spain, Carlos II. But why would an English ship be named after a Spanish king? Even though England and her pirates had fought with Spain for most of the 17th century, by the final decade, they had allied to counter the expansion of France. A group of London investors now acquired a license to trade and salvage the wrecks of Spanish galleons. They purchased 3 ships to form a small fleet, but for the flagship, decided to construct a brand new vessel. A fast and agile ship of force, a frigate of 46 guns, classified as a 5th rate. In honor of their Spanish patron, they named her Charles II. The Charles, or Fancy as I'll call her for convenience, was built during an exciting time for shipbuilding. Judging by her amount of cannon, she would have been a 5th rate of the new classifications designed in 1689. This has been regarded as the birth of the first real frigates. A strong, heavily armed ship specialized in cruising. A perfect balance between durability, firepower, and speed. In other words, the perfect privateer. The Fancy would have had a tonnage of around 400, and the length of between 90 to 110 feet, 27 to 33 meters. Inspired by earlier galley frigates, these new frigates had a considerable length-to-breadth ratio, even though they weren't designed specifically for rowing. It was a measure to improve speed. These innovative new frigates, designed by Lord Torrington, had a bigger emphasis on their all-weather capabilities, habitability, and sailing qualities. The first was improved by increasing the freeboard to the gun ports, making water less likely to enter the ship. Habitability was improved by making the lower decks more clear and ventilated for the cruise conditions. By setting the lower deck at the waterline, the height of the side was reduced and made the ship more weatherly, improving her sailing qualities. As a full-rigged ship, the Fancy would have had 3 masts, primarily rigged with square sails. The bowsprit would have had a spritsail, a sprit topmast with a sprit topsail, 3 courses on the foremast, 3 on the main, and on the mizzen a triangular mizzen sail, and possibly a square mizzen topsail. Like all 5th rates, the Fancy would have had 2 gun decks. The upper gun deck was divided between the exposed weather deck, the fortified forecastle, and the protected quarterdeck. The weather deck housed the majority of the ship's armaments, around 26-pounders. The sheltered quarterdeck housed a smaller battery of around 6 3-pounders. During this period, it was quite common to mount guns inside of the captain's quarters. The heavy artillery is mounted on the lower gun deck, for the sake of stability. This would have been around 18 9-pounders. In terms of small arms, she was kitted with multiple cases of Buccaneer guns, a type of very long musket, popularized by the legendary hunters of Hispaniola and said to have remarkable accuracy. With the ship stocked and provisioned, the small fleet set sail for the port of A Coruña in northwestern Spain. The crew were supposed to pick up papers and further instructions from the Spanish government. but delays led to a conspiracy theory of the Protestant crewmen about to be arrested and made into slaves. This prompted one of the officers, Henry Every, to lead a mutiny aboard the Charles. The Charles was not really a fitting name for a pirate ship full of Protestant fanatics and English patriots, so they renamed it to the Fancy. Not to mention the fact that the Charles it was named after was an inbred mess. Every sailed the Fancy to Bioko off the African coast, where the vessel was beached, careened, and the superstructures modified. We do not know exactly how much Every modified the ship, only that she was made exceedingly fast. In 1695, she was chased by a group of East Indiamen, they reporting the following. Our honor ships going into that island gave him chase, but he was too nimble for them by much, having taken down a great deal of his upper work and made her exceeding snug, which advantage being added to her well sailing before, causing her to sail so hard now that she fears not who follows her. Most likely, Every would have removed the topmost cabin, roundhouse called, galleries, and carved works. If he wanted to go to the next level, he might have taken down the cabin and forecastle, basically gutting the ship to the waterline. The Fancy did not engage in many battles, none of which were especially long. At Cape Verde, a group of English merchantmen surrendered as soon as she opened her lower tier of gun ports. Off the coast of Guinea, she battled 2 Danish merchant ships, both of whom carried between 20 to 30 guns. It might have seemed like a formidable opponent, and though the Danes resisted bravely for about an hour, they were defeated with 4 or 5 losses, having only killed a single pirate. Her second battle occurred en route from the Red Sea to India, against the large but poorly armed Fateh Muhammad. The Mughal was given a broadside, boarded, and taken. Next, the Fancy tracked down and engaged her greatest prize and greatest battle, the Ganges Sawai. The Gunsway, as she was called in English, carried around 60 cannon and weighed almost twice as much as the Fancy. She towered above the pirate, and climbing aboard would have been akin to scaling a castle wall. The Fancy fired a warning shot to demand the Mughal surrender, and as a response, the Mughal hoisted the imperial flag and fired both of her heavy stern guns. Soon the 2 vessels came side by side and began a bombardment at around 100 to 200 yards distance. Another consequence of the Fancy's lowering was that higher ships like the Gunsway struggled at actually hitting her. And though the pirates sustained casualties, it doesn't seem as though they were grievous during the initial phase of the battle. Though the Fancy was well armed, her 6 and 9 pounders would have been unable to pierce the hull of a ship as thick as the Gunsway. Instead, they trained her guns on the Gunsway's rig. One lucky shot managed to sever the Mogul's mainmast, crippling the other mast as a result and making her near impossible to handle. Meanwhile, one of the Mughal's cannons blew up by accident, killing 4 men and demoralizing the rest. The pirates saw their chance. They closed in, climbed aboard, and after a bloody melee, the Gunsway had been conquered. Following the capture of the Gunsway, the crew and passengers fell victim to a depraved series of abuse. Men were tortured, and the female passengers were, well, you can probably guess. When the pirates had their fun, they took their loot and let the prizes go. The Fancy sailed south, crossed the Cape of Good Hope, and crossed the Atlantic over to America. The fact that she was able to make this trip back and forth without significant issues attests to the quality of the vessel. She could have been the pirate ship to conquer the seas, but with his hold now loaded with treasure, Every sought to retire and wished to get rid of her. In April of 1696, Every arrived on the Bahamian island of Providence. He managed to get an audience with Governor Nicholas Trott, offering him the ship and a huge sum of money in return for the pirates' protection and anonymity. He didn't say that they were pirates, but independent slave traders. With Providence under constant threat from the French, the ship, veteran crew, and cache of weapons looked very promising. Trott accepted. By now, the Fancy was in a shoddy condition. and Trott removed all of the cargo, rigging, anchors and cannons. And after Avery left for Ireland, he beached the Fancy on Hog Island. Mariners who passed by recognized her as Charles II, the privateer turned pirate. Perhaps the skeleton of the ship still lay there in 1715, when Providence was turned into a pirate nest. With Avery being idolized by the Providence pirates, the Fancy's wreckage must have served as a great inspiration. A pirate's biggest advantage was stealth. Sailing in secrecy allowed them to dodge the authorities, and when a pirate ship sank, it virtually disappeared from existence. It is part of the reason we know so little about them. Few of them remain, few have well-documented stories, and fewer have been depicted by eyewitnesses. We don't really know for a certain what pirate ships look like. The Golden Fleece is an exception in all regards. She was illustrated by a man who saw her. Her shipwreck was found in 2009, and her unusual and exciting story is well worth remembering. The Golden Fleece was named after the classical Greek story, in which Jason and his Argonauts search for the golden coat, fleece, of a magical ram. Perhaps the name indicated the search for such a magical trove, something which could guarantee your fortunes and well-being for the rest of your life. The Fleece was a merchant ship, perhaps between 200 to 400 tons burthen, close to 100 feet long and armed with 30 guns, making her a formidable foe to any pirate foolish or brave enough. She is depicted here by Navy sailor John Taylor. Her owner was a merchant named Joseph Bannister. Next to nothing is known about him. He was careening the ship in Port Royal, Jamaica. This meant tipping the ship over on its side in order to clean barnacles from the bottom. There was neither current nor wind, but when the men moved from one side to the other, the guns and other weights used to tip the ship rolled out of control, causing the ship to list heavily into the ocean. Bannister managed to save himself by holding onto the mizzen shrouds, but none of the crewmen drowned. The Fleece was eventually refloated and continued to bring passengers between Jamaica and London. However, by 1684, Bannister was in heavy debt, possibly from the accident 4 years prior. In order to sell his debts, Bannister decided to turn pirate. He assembled 115 sloopmen, referred to as the veriest rogues in these Indies, and sailed to Saint-Domingue, hoping to acquire a French commission. This was illegal, and the outraged Jamaican governor sent out a pirate hunting flotilla to catch the Fleece. Bannister and his men were found collecting turtles, and were easily captured without a fight. Bannister was taken to trial, with the jury hoping that the 2 Spanish prisoners found aboard the Golden Fleece would testify against him. However, Bannister borrowed more money, putting himself in further debt, and used the loan to bribe the fishermen. All charges against him were dropped, partly because Governor Lynch was sick and dying. His subsequent successor, Henry Molesworth, attempted to revive the case without success, though he would keep his eyes on Bannister and his Golden Fleece. The captain was simply ordered to stay put in Port Royal. Now sunk deeper in debt, Bannister appointed a new master of the Fleece and sent her on a voyage to London, not making any profit. He attempted to trade with the Spanish without success. With his financial woes spiraling out of control, he had to do something desperate. Rehiring his old crew of scoundrels, Bannister got aboard the Fleece in secret. He raised the anchor and slowly slipped from the harbor. He had to be careful, because he would have to pass by the Port Royal fort, heavily armed and told to fire at Bannister should he leave unauthorized. Bannister was prepared for the worst, and had 50 men ready in the hold with plugs and repair materials to stop any shot holes. Luckily for him, these sentries were careless, and did not spot the Fleece until it was too late. The commander was alerted. The fort opened fire. The Fleece took 3 hits, but it wasn't enough. Bannister had escaped. The governor issued him a stern warning, and although Bannister promised not to engage in any piracy, he was soon discovered in the ranks of notorious filibusters like Laurens de Graaf and the Chevalier de Grammont. The Fleece took part in the raid on Campeche in 1685. The pirates divided their loot and afterwards split up. She was sighted off Jamaica in late November, and 2 sloops were dispatched to deal with her. When they arrived, the Fleece was gone. The French authorities were unable or unwilling to stop the Fleece, allowing her to continue to Hispaniola's eastern end and the Bay of Samana. Here the pirates set up a base, specifically on a place then called Bannister's Island. After capturing multiple Spanish ships, Jamaica dispatched 2 frigates to deal with him. When the frigates arrived, Bannister was careening his Golden Fleece, unable to mount her for a defense. However, all of the guns had been carried ashore and mounted in earthen batteries, concealed behind trees. This allowed Bannister and his boys to put up a fierce resistance. The battle raged on for 2 whole days, when the Navy ships finally ran out of powder and had to escape. It was far from a victory for the Golden Fleece, for she had been battered into a Cheshire cheese, so full of holes that Bannister had to set her alight, and departed in a small bark. He settled down among the Mosquito Indians, but some of his former crewmen ratted him out to the Navy. The Mosquito handed him over, but the Navy decided not to take him to trial. They feared he would somehow escape it again, so they hanged him right then and there from the yardarm. The wreck of the Golden Fleece was found in 2009 by John Chatterton and John Matera. Both loved treasure, and both were named John, which basically qualifies them as pirates. By this point, nothing but the skeleton hull of the Golden Fleece remained, and a number of artifacts once belonging to Bannister and his crew. There were musket barrels, a knife and a cutlass, bowls with uneaten food still inside of them, and an expensive wine glass that undoubtedly belonged to the captain himself. Here's a toast to Captain Bannister. Steed, steed bonnet, steed bonnet, steed bonnet. So, we usually imagine pirate ships as having very creative, terrifying and badass names like the Black Pearl, the adjective verb, the hold up, let me check the fantasy name generator. Perfect. The Hades Death, the disrespectful minnow, the New Coward. Man, these names fucking suck. These sorts of cool names were quite uncommon. And pirate ships might have flat out goofy names like the Orange Tree or the Merry Christmas. In most cases, they weren't even creative enough to come up with something new, and often defaulted to something basic. A lot of English ships were called the Greyhound, and a lot, and I mean a lot, were called Revenge. It isn't a unique name, but one of the most unique pirate ships was named Revenge, and perhaps not unbefittingly. Stede Bonnet was a Barbadian planter, and grandson of Sir Thomas Whetstone, a relative of Oliver Cromwell who used nepotism to become a Buccaneer captain. Whetstone is actually one of my favorite Buccaneers, so it's always fun to mention him, and since he wasn't too competent and often played second fiddle to much greater captains, he does make sense as an ancestor of the more famous Bonnet. Bonnet is usually remembered for his eccentricity and unusual career as a pirate. For some uncertain reason, usually blamed on depression or insanity, Bonnet decided to abandon his cushy life as a plantationer and become a pirate. In 1716, he purchased a 60-ton sloop built in Rhode Island. We have relatively few images of period ships remaining, meaning that our understanding of their design is limited. And also the fact that every region of the New World constructed their vessels in a unique fashion. And sailors could recognize if a sloop was from Jamaica, Bermuda, or Rhode Island, though they seldom clarified to us what the visible differences were, and taken it for granted. In 1729, an eyewitness described a wrecked sloop as follows: Rhode Island built, with a blue stern, 2 cabin windows, her counter painted yellow with 2 black ovals. Her sides were painted yellow, her moldings were all white. Perhaps this sloop would have been similar. Her name was Revenge. Maybe the name appealed to Bonnet, who might have harbored some perceived grudge against whomever, maybe the world itself. Evidence does point to him being a Jacobite, a rebellious supporter of the deposed Stuart dynasty, a popular opinion among Caribbean aristocrats and among pirates. Apart from the name, the Revenge must have been of excellent quality, as many other pirates would later desire her, and she would prove herself both in sailing and calamity. With a tonnage of 60 tons burthen, Bonnet commissioned a local shipyard to fit her with 14 cannons, not to mention the comforts expected by a man of his status. His cabin included a sizable library of books, and it is possible that Bonnet, whose parents died at a young age, might have grown up with books, and been inspired by the journals and stories of pirates, explorers, and adventurers. He then hired a crew of 100 men, and curiously decided to pay them in set wages, whereas most pirates and privateers expected shares of the acquired plunder. It might not be as weird as some people think. Since he was already rich, he had the money to pay his men, preventing discontent and potential mutiny if his lack of experience rendered no prizes. Furthermore, merchant ships paid their men in wages, even when these merchants carried letters of marque, permitting them to also take prizes. Some letter of marque ships paid their men in a hybrid of wages and shares. Bonnet and his boys also designed their own Jolly Roger, a black pirate flag for signaling their intent to potential plunders. He is usually imagined as flying a black banner with a skull over a bone, a dagger on one side and a heart on the other, but it appears to be a modern fabrication. Newspapers, colonial and trial documents all testify to him only ever using a red flag and a black flag with a death's head, same as basically every pirate. We can see this flag, and presumably the Revenge, depicted in this woodcut. The Revenge exited Barbados without clearance, immediately breaking the law. She sailed for the northern colonies. The coast of North Carolina was home to so many coves and harbors, where the Revenge could be concealed, with lookouts on shore, spying for ships. When a ship was spotted, the Revenge set sail and ran her down. Having taken several prizes, Bonnet proceeded to Charleston. Positioning himself at the entrance to the deep harbor, Bonnet managed to take 2 valuable ships, keeping the crew prisoner to prevent them from alerting the town and its fleet. However, after one of his captives recognized him, Bonnet decided to depart. He wished to remain anonymous. The Revenge sailed south, with Bonnet hoping to salvage the wrecks of the Spanish treasure fleet. Emboldened by his early success, he decided to engage a larger vessel, believing it to be a merchantman. It turned out to be a Spanish man-of-war, likely dispatched to patrol the area for salvagers and pirates. Bonnet was among those injured in the first broadside, and had to be taken below deck. After a couple more shots, half of the crew lay dead or wounded, and the Revenge just narrowly escaped. The sloop made way for the pirate haven of Nassau, New Providence. It was here that Bonnet became acquainted with Edward Tetch, more famously known as Blackbeard. If you're wondering about my pronunciation of Tetch, it is usually pronounced as Teach or Thatch, but according to Blackbeard historian Kevin Duffus, whom I interviewed a few years ago, linguists specializing in the early modern English spoken in the 18th century say that his name would have been pronounced as I said it. Anyway, Blackbeard was currently sailing in a small 6-gun sloop, and the adventure looked like a promising upgrade. Bonnet agreed to elect him as the new captain, with one newspaper saying that Bonnet had no command whatsoever, but was walking about the deck in a morning gown before returning back to his books. Blackbeard's old sloop was given to a subordinate, and the 2 sloops departed for the northern colonies, terrorizing them as revenge for executing pirates. I guess she was finally living up to her name. Blackbeard now wanted a bigger ship, and sailed south to the Lesser Antilles. Here they managed to capture the slave ship La Concorde, which Blackbeard outfitted into his new flagship. Bonnet was given back command of the sloop Revenge. It wasn't perhaps the best idea. After some time of sailing as Blackbeard's protege, Bonnet had increased his sailing and combat experience, and now wanted to prove it by taking on a heavily armed merchant, the Protestant Caesar. He managed to steer the Revenge behind the merchant, bombarding her from the unguarded stern. The Caesar refused to surrender, and coming about, continued the battle for 3 hours. When night fell, a battered Revenge had to escape. Blackbeard was furious. He was deeply concerned with the reputation of pirates as undefeatable. If they would ever show weakness, his enemies would be emboldened. He therefore tracked down the Caesar, seized her without a fight, and had her burned and sunk. The crew, luckily, were spared. Bonnet wasn't so lucky. Blackbeard initiated a mutiny, in which Bonnet was deposed and replaced by a man named Richards. With the flotilla sailing north again, the pirates contracted some unknown disease, possibly syphilis, and Bonnet suggested they blockade his previous target of Charleston, North Carolina, and acquire a chest of medicines. Though they weren't able to take the town itself, they did get what they wanted, and departed once more, this time to clean Blackbeard's frigate. She ran aground and sank at Beaufort Inlet. Bonnet departed for nearby Bath Town, where he managed to secure a pardon. Returning to Beaufort, Blackbeard had vanished, having departed in a small and inferior Spanish sloop, leaving the superior Revenge behind, its crew marooned on a nearby island. Why Blackbeard did this is uncertain, and has to be discussed in a future episode. Bonnet rescued his men and recovered the sloop, and after failing to find Blackbeard and take revenge on him, I guess he kinda had to change the name and had it rechristened to Royal James. The name was a tribute to the pretender King of England, supported by the pirate Jacobites. Despite his pardon, he then resumed his usual activities. Having now been at sea for close to a year, the James was finally starting to leak. Bonnet had her taken up the Cape Fear River, where he spent the next 2 months repairing her with materials salvaged from a stolen shallop. The pirates were waiting for the hurricane season to end, after which they would sail to St. Thomas and acquire commissions. Before then, they were tracked down by 2 pirate hunting sloops, led by Colonel William Rhett. Unfortunately, the hunters ran aground in the shallow waters. Bonnet sent out 3 scouting canoes, thinking the sloops a pair of merchants. They hastily rowed back, and Bonnet prepared his crew for battle. For those refusing to fight, Bonnet promised that he would blow their brains out. He then rage-posted an angry letter to the nearby governor, and promising him that he would burn and destroy any and all ships coming in or out of South Carolina. Come morrow, the James set sail. His hope was to lure the hunters into a running fight, but the sloops caught up and got on each side of him. However, all of them ran aground on the shallows. While some men worked to get the sloops free, others exchanged fire with great guns and small arms. During the battle, one of Bonnet's forced crewmen refused to partake, and just before Bonnet could execute him, one of his close compatriots got shot and killed. Bonnet was distraught and distracted. The firefight continued for another 5 hours. When the tide came in, one of the hunters managed to wrestle free, disengaged, and repair their shattered rigging. Returning to board the pirate, Bonnet and his men hoisted a white flag, surrendering. The pirate gunner had wanted to blow up the James and kill everyone aboard in glorious fire, had his shipmates not stopped him. Bonnet was taken to trial, and soon after, hanged. The Royal James was still in a fine condition, and the governor absorbed her into his pirate hunting fleet. The poacher had become a gamekeeper. Of course, the name was now a bit embarrassing in the service of His Royal Majesty, and she was seemingly rechristened to the Henry. In 1718, when the Carolina coast was threatened by the pirate Christopher Moody, she departed together with a 4-ship flotilla to track the scoundrel down. They managed instead to corner Richard Worley, captain of the sloop New York Revenge and the New York's Revenge. Because yeah, pirates were not always creative with the ship names. Closing in on the pirates, the crewmen aboard the hunters hid themselves as to seem fewer in number and appear like merchants. The pirates fell for the ploy, and when they closed in, black flags flying, the Commodore gave the signal. The hunters all hoisted a Union Jack, releasing devastating broadsides and volleys of muskets. The pirate flagship broke through the gauntlet and into the open ocean, with two of the hunters pursuing. The Henry and the Sea Nymph cornered the pirate sloop, battering her into submission. After a few hours, Worley himself was killed in the engagement, the rest of his men surrendering. They were put on trial and executed. One of the most curious findings aboard the ship were the great many women. These were convicts sent from London as indentured servants, liberated by the pirates who intended to take them as wives. During the battle, they had assisted their future husbands in loading muskets and passing gunpowder. Romantic, perhaps, but maybe like all Romans, futile all the same. Most pirate ships were small. Brigantines, sloops, piraguas, sometimes just the humble canoe. It was exceedingly rare for them to command any sort of large vessels, and even the exceptionally big ones like the Fancy and Golden Fleece were rare in the first place and small in comparison to the biggest ships possessed by state navies. Pirate ships were small, but there's always an exception to the rule, no matter how few those exceptions are. That brings us on to the biggest pirate ship of the Golden Age, the Defense, formerly known as the Nossa Senhora do Cabo, formerly the Gelderland. The change in name already shows how common it was for ships to change hands between nations. It's already getting convoluted, so let's start from the beginning. The Gelderland was born in 1711, a second-rate ship of the line constructed by Jan van Renen in Amsterdam. There was nothing to ever indicate that she would at some point hoist the Black Skull and Bones, the banner hostile to all mankind. The second rates were not suited for pirate tactics whatsoever, being slow, lumberly, and intended for the sluggish line battles in which massive warships tested their mettle with hours of relentless cannonadery. If that's not a word, I just pulled a Shakespeare on ya. Better tell Dr. Johnson.
It is a common word down our way.
Although we have no images preserved of the Gelderland per se, there are still plenty of images of similar looking ships, and the dimensions of the vessel have been retained. She was 45 meters long, 12 meters broad, and 4.5 meters deep. She carried a whopping 72 guns, the heaviest being 26 18-pounders, and a complement of 460 men and officers. In 1716, the Dutch state authorized the Admiralty to sell 3 of their older big ships and use the money to construct new vessels. In 1717, these 3 vessels, including the Gelderland, were sold to the Portuguese for a total sum of 360,000 guilders. For some reason, the Portuguese decided that this enormous vessel would be excellent for a diplomatic mission to India, intended to carry home the Viceroy of Goa. On the way home, she was loaded with wealthy passengers, carrying between them a boatload of unfathomable treasures. When the vessel closed in on the island of Mauritius, she was suddenly hit by a terrible storm. The Viceroy narrated the transpiring events. They were only sailing under the mizzen, the wind so strong that the compass turned, and the sea became frightful. The next day, the storm intensified. In less than an hour, all of the masts were taken down, only the bowsprit remained. Holes were torn in the hull, and 7 feet of water entered the inside. The crew began to lose courage, but the Count took charge and shouted orders, yet the whirlwind continued. At daybreak, they found the rudders split from top to bottom, rendering them unable to steer. They were forced to repair the rudder with iron bars and ropes, likewise throwing 9 cannons overboard, and much of the merchandise and ship stores. Still the storm continued, all the while they pumped desperately to keep the water out. 4 days later, the storm subsided, allowing them to erect a small sail. When the storm weakened further, they were able to jury-rig masts and add enough sails to carry them into Ile de Bourbon, now called Reunion. By some luck and considerable skill, the Gelderland had survived. Their joy wasn't to last. Someone had been watching them. They finally arrived some 2 weeks later, laying anchor in the northern harbor. Much of the crew were now sick, the viceroy himself being unable to walk, but they were received amicably by the local French. Things were looking good. On the 16th of April, 1721, 2 ships flying English colors bore down on the Cabo. The viceroy walked out of the governor's house and went aboard the Cabo. There were no fortifications or ships to protect her. The locals had only canoes, and they sat by on the shore, watching the strange scene transpire. As the ships closed in, they changed their English colors for black ones, with skulls and crossed bones. They fired muskets and artillery. The viceroy attempted to return a broadside, but the few guns remaining were in poor condition, one having been fouled by seawater, and 6 having been dismantled from their carriages. They had only 34 muskets to distribute between a crew of 130. Meanwhile, the pirates counted some 300 men, with a total of 80 guns distributed between the 2 ships, the Cassandra and Victory. The former was commanded by an older pirate named Jasper Seeger, said to have sailed with Henry Every, the latter by a flying gang veteran named Olivier Levasseur. The Victory came under the Cabo's bowsprit, while the Cassandra came alongside her, attempting to board the Portuguese. They were repelled by gunfire and had to go astern of her. Here they bombarded the Cabo until they had cleared the quarterdeck, after which they circled around to her other side for a second boarding attempt. 100 men threw over grappling hooks and climbed aboard the treasure ship, while Levasseur's pirates stormed from the bow. Many of the Portuguese had been killed or wounded. Some surrendered and even joined the pirates there on the spot, and others leapt into the sea and swam ashore. The viceroy soon found himself alone in the steerage with 20 of his loyal followers, surrounded by the murderous scoundrels. He constantly found himself a target owing to his distinctive scarlet coat, but somehow managed to avoid a hail of bullets, all the while personally firing artillery upon them. Soon the gunfight devolved into melee, and even when the viceroy's sword broke in 2, he refused to surrender. Surrounded on all sides, someone suddenly told the pirates to stand down. It was the quartermaster, Richard Taylor. Had it not been for him, the viceroy would have been torn to pieces. He was taken into custody and treated quite politely. The pirates even returned to him his cross and his broken sword, because they didn't really need it. They had just become the richest pirates on earth. Aside from a valuable haul of silk, spices, porcelain, exotic wood furniture, and other such luxuries, the pirates found a great haul of jewelry worth as much as 500,000 pounds. Every pirate received a share of 42 small diamonds, and according to legend, one pirate who had earned a single big diamond smashed it into little pieces in a mortar, and afterwards bragged that he had now made more than 42. The total value of the plunder has been estimated between 200 to 400 million US dollars in today's money, and though we cannot know for certain, Levasseur and his comrades had now committed one of the greatest criminal heists in all of history. The viceroy was ransomed, but upon returning to Portugal, he was tragically banned from the royal court for 10 months. The pirates sailed next to St. Mary, Madagascar, where they spent several months partying and refitting the Cabo into a pirate flagship, the largest and most heavily armed in all of history. Masts were repaired, the armament brought up to 72 guns, and the upper decks were lightly cut, galleries removed, to make her more snug and weatherly. Command of her was passed on to Richard Taylor, who decided to rename her Defense. When they caught wind of a navy squadron hunting for them, they decided to depart. The pirates took refuge on the African coast, trading with the natives and capturing the Dutch fort at Delagoa without a fight. It would have been unable to resist a vessel as large and heavily armed like the Defense, and we can see her depicted in this image. Among the captives was a hydrographer named Jacob de Bucoy, who recorded his stay with Taylor and Levasseur, documenting life aboard the ship and the rocky relationship between those two pirates. The two eventually decided to split up, probably for the best, with Taylor heading back to America. Levasseur wanted to continue pirating, and so received command of the superior defense. The world now looked like his oyster. Those ships like the defense were totally unsuitable for the Caribbean Sea, with its shallow waters and treacherous reefs. She was perfect for the open waters of the Indian Ocean, well traveled by large and wealthy company ships, the coastlines pricked with forts and factories, easily battered into submission by a broadside of 36 guns, bearing open the riches inside those brick and mortar walls. A floating castle, she could remain on the open ocean for months, without ever having to touch dry land. She could have accomplished great things. She could have been the cherry to top off Levasseur's long and unfortunate pirate career. But she wouldn't. Instead, when the defense rounded the northern tip of Madagascar, Levasseur wrecked his flagship. That was the fourth shipwreck of his career. So ended the story of history's biggest pirate ship ever. They had captured her by luck, a half-starved and drunken complement of pirates stumbling into a massive treasure ship, already defeated by storm and disease, using her to take maybe one or two ships and a half-defended fort, and then, by unluck, she was taken back into Lady Fortune's bosom. I always like to end these episodes with a bang. That is, some entry that is severely underrated, not being well known whatsoever, despite holding a grandiose story worthy to be told. In the last iteration, I concluded with the epic story of the Blessed Trinity, and I can find no more appropriate sequel than the Bachelor's Delight, a vessel which carried many of the Trinity's former crewmen, which, according to legend, was won in a game of cards, and was the first ship to ever visit Antarctica. To bring us up to speed, the Blessed Trinity was a Spanish ship captured by a group of buccaneers who entered the Pacific Ocean via the Darien Isthmus. After going on several misadventures, some of the crewmen, including William Dampier, Lionel Wafer, and John Cook, decided to part ways and return via the Isthmus. The Trinity went south, rounded South America, and returned to the Caribbean, where she was sold on the Danish island of St. Thomas. Meanwhile, John Cook had, after a string of misadventures in the Caribbean basin, made himself captain of a small ship called the, you guessed it, Revenge. Of course a pirate named John captured a ship named Revenge, and he reconnected with Dampier and Wafer. Mustering additional forces in Virginia, the old Buccaneers did not feel satisfied with their previous Pacific adventure, and wanted to go on a second cruise. They set sail. In November of 1683, the Revenge arrived in Guinea, where they encountered a Danish slave ship named the Charlotte Amalia, captained by Thomas Towson. She was a small, 14-gun frigate of 180 tons, seemingly unimpressive, but freshly built, seaworthy, and of considerable speed. Accompanying two larger ships from German Brandenburg, she was looking to buy slaves from the Brandenburger slave fort of Gross Friedrichsburg. That was when she was spotted by the pirates. Although Dampier preferred to call himself and his fellows privateers, these scoundrels were anything but legal. They had previously captured an allied Dutch ship, some of the Dutchmen willingly joining them, and Denmark was nothing if not an ally in politics and religion. The attack on the Charlotte Amalia was nothing but an act of blatant piracy, and Dampier chose not to include it in his journal. He was more keen to write about flamingos. One of his shipmates, William Ambrosia Cowley, did write of the attack in his initial writings, but when they were published, the attack on the Charlotte was censured by the publisher. According to legend, Cowley won the ship after a game of cards with a Danish captain, no doubt pickled by several glasses of rum. Kurson was apparently an older gentleman, which might have contributed to his confusion. In a Danish document, the capture was explained as follows. His frigate Charlotte Amalia, with 36 guns and well manned, in a blink of the eye clever by a small English pirate with 4 guns was taken, because he was not aware. A different story, and one which appears more likely, claims that the poorly armed Revenge hid most of her men below deck, keeping only enough to sail her, and thus appearing like a merchantman. When they came close, Captain Cook made a loud signal. The pirates boarded the Dane, and after sustaining 5 losses, captured her. Describing her as a lovely ship and fit for a very long voyage, they decided to rename her Bachelor's Delight. The name seems to have had a double meaning. Many of the crewmen were recent college graduates, and most of them were unmarried. On a relevant note, we do not know the fate of the 70 female slaves carried aboard. They were possibly sold or given back to the Danish. Nor is it certain what happened to the Revenge. Some say she was burned to destroy all evidence. Others say she was given to the Danes as a consolation. Crossing the South Atlantic, the Bachelor continued down the American coast and rounded Cape Horn, entering the Pacific Ocean. They suffered a biting cold, with Cowley claiming that they sailed farther than any ship have sailed before south, and befitting to the ship's name, spent Valentine's Day discussing the intrigues of women. This apparently brought on a storm. Closing in on the port of Valdivia, the Bachelor joined forces with 2 other pirate ships, the Nicholas and the Signet, commanded by Charles Swan, who was very fat, and piloted by a friend of Dampier and Wafer, Basil Ringrose. He had been aboard the Blessed Trinity until the very end, documenting most of her story. They went further north to Juan Fernandez, where they rescued another old friend, a Mosquito Indian named William, who had been left behind during the Trinity's voyage after an escape from the Spanish Navy. With the boys back in town, or back aboard, I guess, the small flotilla ravaged the South American coast in search of plunder. Following Captain Swan's blustering attempt of trade in Valdivia, the entire coast had been put on high alert, and nothing of value would leave the ports by sea. They sailed next to the beautiful Galapagos Islands, which Dampier and Cowley made sure to write about extensively in their books. Charles Darwin, on his own expedition there, made sure to bring the writings of Dampier. The Bachelor and company continued to Mexico, where Captain Cook perished after a long period of sickness. After burying him ashore, the Buccaneers raided the vicinity for cattle, continuing then to the Gulf of Amapaya to careen their ships. Cook was replaced by his quartermaster, Edward Davis. After some further misadventures, they managed to intercept a mail carrier, bearing the news that the Silver Fleet was soon to arrive in Panama. Hoping to ambush it, the pirates made a base at the Pearl Islands in the Panama Bay. Here they were joined by additional Buccaneer ships and companies, soon growing to 900 French and Englishmen and a fleet of 10 ships. It was the largest pirate contingent ever gathered in the Pacific Ocean. On the 28th of May, the Silver Fleet approached. With their ships more well armed and manned, the Buccaneers were facing a difficult fight, but resolved to bear down on them regardless. The Spanish, in turn, deployed a clever ruse. They confused the Buccaneers about the position of their ships by snuffing out and relighting their lanterns, convincing them that the fleet had changed position. When dawn rose, the pirates found that the enemy had the weather gauge. They decided to run, the Spanish in hot pursuit. Unable to amass any booty, the company broke out into disputes, and everyone soon parted ways. Dampier, wanting to explore more of Mexico, went aboard a Signet, whereas Davis took the Bachelor and continued roaming the South American coast. After about a year of raiding, they finally decided to round Cape Horn, and dreadful weather brought them so far south that they came close to Antarctica. Apparently, they were the first people to ever see this massive, frigid continent. It wouldn't be visited again until 1819. They continued north and rounded Brazil, where they received news of a general amnesty granted to all pirates. It was met with much joy, but Lionel Wafer was suspicious. Calling for a meeting, he claimed that should they return to England all at once with all of their loot, they would probably be recognized as pirates and hanged in spite of any royal proclamation. He suggested that they should draw straws, determining where in the Americas they should go. Firstly, they went to Jamaica and received the royal pardons. They sailed next to Philadelphia, where they divided their plunder and sold the Bachelor's delight. A few of the crewmen secretly hired a lawyer to buy the Bachelor for them, wishing to go on a second cruise, but it wasn't to be. Wafer and 3 of his companions took a ferry to Virginia, where they registered themselves as pardoned pirates and placed their stolen silver with a local bank. They were arrested by an overzealous naval commander. Wafer and his friends were taken to trial, where they managed to negotiate their releases in return for their stolen silver. It was used to fund the construction of the College of William and Mary. What happened to the Bachelor after this point is uncertain. In the coming years, the name appears in the hands of pirates on multiple occasions, notably in the Red Sea and around Madagascar. It is uncertain if any of these ships is the same vessel as the one we now know and love. As if her career couldn't get more impressive. It is likely that her exploits had become somewhat legendary at this point, and several of her crewmen would continue roving the seas, even going to Madagascar. The name was likely nostalgic to them. I've also heard rumors of 2 period depictions of the Bachelor, one from a French map of the Caribbean and one from a map of the Galapagos Islands. There are many maps fitting these descriptions, and I've not been able to pinpoint any depiction of the Bachelor. This would really be a true pirate treasure, but such is the nature of pirate history, shrouded in mystery. If you want to learn about more legendary pirate ships, please tell me in the comments, and if there is enough interest, I will make a follow-up. Until then, please check out this predecessor episode, also covering a list of 5. The best way of supporting me is by becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. You will also get early and ad-free access to all of my videos. Enjoy!